Thank you so much, Alin, for having us. We work together at Toronto Urban Native Ministry, which was founded in 1996 and is a really wonderful ecumenical initiative that serves Indigenous people across the GTA. Thanks again for having us for our workshop today. And I'll turn it over to my colleague.
Leigh, maybe if you can stop sharing, Leigh, then I think Sandra can share.
You're muted, Sandra.
I'm notorious for doing that, being muted and keep talking. But I like to welcome everybody here. And so a general format is, I'd just like to share the importance of community building and healing through becoming informed and information exchange and sharing resources through mutual respecting and caring. So keeping that in mind, I'm going to share a video here. I've shared it before in the past. It's about 11 minutes long. It's the smudging prayer, a directional prayer, a gathering prayer, a little teaching on the water, and some drumming. So let me share that, and everyone please enjoy. And where did the video go? There we go. With honesty, as we prepare ourselves to meet our Creator, may our hands be cleansed that they can create beautiful things with love. With great respect, may your eyes be cleansed that you might see the signs and great wonders of the Creator's world. May your ears be cleansed that you can bravely hear and see the truth. May your throat be cleansed that you might speak rightly with loving kindness when words are needed. May your feet be cleansed that you might take you where you are most needed to be through your journey on the pathway of life. May your heart be cleansed that you might hear its messages clearly with humility. May the people, while learning together, become mindful and receive the wisdom, while the sacred space be washed and cleaned by the fragrant smoke of this sage. May that same smoke, while spiraling to the heavens, carry our petitions of truth to our Creator. Now that we are of one mind and unified as the people. I like to acknowledge that eastern direction, the direction where the sun rises and new beginnings start, as we're on our spiritual path. This is a direction where we first enter into. It is also a direction of love, also a direction of springtime, where that little robin comes out, and also when things starting to break through Mother Earth. And if I haven't mentioned anything, or if I'm unaware of it, I'll acknowledge that now and say Miigwech and now Agoa. And then I like to acknowledge that southern direction as we're entering in it while we're continuing on in our spiritual path. This is a direction of summertime. This is also a direction for our youth that are full of energy. This is also a direction that while we're in action and working real hard, we're still continuing on our spiritual path. And if I haven't mentioned it, or if I'm unaware of it, I'll acknowledge that now and say Miigwech and now Agoa. Then I like to acknowledge that western direction, the direction of the great mystery. There's no true words to describe it, but that is the direction that we walk out of. This is also a direction where our adults sit. And this is where we offer our petitions and our prayers to the spiritual realm. And if I haven't mentioned it, or if I'm unaware of it, I'll acknowledge that now and say, Miigwech, and now Goa. Then I'd like to acknowledge that northern direction, the direction where our elders sit with the long, gray, snowy hair. These are the ones that we present our tobacco ties to so we can get some good direction in our lives. This is also a time to acknowledge that when we're tired, we rest. When we're hungry, we eat. And it's also a time that when we come together as family or as in community to share stories and songs and teachings. And if I haven't mentioned it or if I'm unaware of it, I'll acknowledge that now and say Miigwech and now Goa. And as we're continuing on in our spiritual path, I'd like to acknowledge our ancestors. These are the ones that went ahead of us. But when they were alive, they did a lot of good work. So we could have this good life today. They could be a grandma, a grandpa, an auntie, or an uncle, or a spiritual mentor, or someone that we hold in high esteem. And these are also where our spirit helpers are. And if I haven't mentioned it, or if I'm unaware of it, I'll acknowledge that now and say Miigwech and now Goa. And then I'd like to acknowledge Mother Earth. She's always there, always providing unconditionally. She provides us with all our clothing, all our food, and all our shelter. And this is a time to remember her and to acknowledge her and to take care of her as she takes care of us. And if I haven't mentioned anything or if I'm unaware of it, I'll acknowledge that now and say Miigwech and now Goa. And as we enter into the center of balance, the center where we meet our Creator, the Creator at birth had given us a good mind to sing songs and praises with our brothers and sisters together. The Creator had known us at birth and knows our spirit name. And as we are in that center and we find our balance and our connection, and we pray and we sing and we offer our petitions. And if I'm not aware of it, or if I haven't mentioned it, I will acknowledge that now and say Miigwech and now Goa. Miigwech, 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 Miigwech. Ahau. With respect, Creator, we give you thanks for all you are and all you bring to us for a visit within creation. The peacemaker Jesus, with love, you place the gospel in the center of this sacred circle through which all of creation is related. You have shown us the way to live honestly, with generosity and compassionate lives. With humility, give us the strength and wisdom to truly live together with respect and commitment as we bravely grow in your spirit. For you are a Creator now and forever. Ahau. Amen. Water is life. Water is what sustains us. Water is what brings us into this world and keeps us in this physical realm. The relationship between water and our well-being is the basic building blocks and affects all aspects of the life cycle. All life is dependent on water, and we are water, and we need water to live. The significance of water in terms of purification of our physical and spiritual lives maintains and keeps us healthy, as we are all spiritual beings. Our relationship between water and well-being is very distinct, especially to the spiritual quality of water
and to the significance of the spirit in terms of creating and sustaining life. All these connections reveal the significant role that plays in our relational practices of pregnancy, birth, renewal, and ceremonies. While the continuation of the life cycle of being, we are constantly reminded the connections to our bodies and the future. The circular connections of water, blood, earth, community, past and future is what links the bond. Our interchangeable relationships and responsibility of taking care of this gift is important, and we've known for a long time that water is alive with spirit. Water can feel your vibrations and carry sound through tears of laughter or sadness, the sense of release. While acknowledging with respect when near water, offer your prayers and thanks for the wonderment of the gifts provided by the Creator. This lullaby is to honor the 215 children that was buried and found in the mass grave at Kamloops Indian Residential School in British Columbia, and for the still yet unfound. Hamba, 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 ya. Hamba, hamba, ya. Hamba, 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 ya. Hamba re ya, we ya. Ha, 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 yo. Ha, yo. We ha, yo. Ha, yo. Hamba re ya, we ya. Hamba, 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 ya. Hamba, hamba, ya. Hamba, 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 ya. Hamba re ya, we ya. Ha, 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 yo. Ha, yo. We ha, yo. Ha, yo. Hamba re ya, we ya.
Okay, so Leigh, what's next?
Yeah, thank you so much for that, Sandra.
Okay, you're welcome.
So we began our time here together by starting with prayer and the powerful opening that Sandra prepared for us, and honoring all those who have not returned home from residential school, honoring the directions and honoring the water, and beginning in that holy and sacred way. We also begin today by acknowledging the territory that the Diocese of Toronto sits upon. Since time immemorial, this has been the sovereign land of the Michi-Saagiig Nishnabeg. This is anglicized to the word Mississauga. You might be familiar with this term, Mississauga, but the Anishinaabe-Moan word that it comes from is Michi-Saagiig, and it means those who live at the mouths of the big rivers. And this honors the tributaries of all the rivers that flow down into Chinibish or Lake Ontario. And the Michi-Saagiig Nishnabeg are also known as the salmon people because they follow the salmon migration, the salmon that live in Lake Ontario to this day, and then move up the tributaries to spawn. So we recognize the beauty of this land, and we give our gratitude to the Michi-Saagiig for stewarding it since time immemorial. The Michi-Saagiig Nishnabeg are of the Anishinaabe Confederacy, and they made treaties with the Wendat Nation, who lived on the south shore of Lake Ontario traditionally, and the Haudenosaunee to be able to farm the land in between the great rivers and creeks and waterways that the Michisagig camp and live upon. And so they developed this incredible symbiotic relationship of living alongside farmers and working together to, despite having a diversity of languages and cultures, to be able to live alongside each other in a good way. And here we see the early settlement, which was also called the York Encampment, when Europeans first came to Michisagig territory. And you'll see in this beautiful watercolor by Edward Walsh, this is looking east upon Front Street in 1803. And Leanne Betamosake Simpson, Michisagig scholar, she talks about how the elders teach that since time immemorial, the whole north shore of Lake Ontario was covered with white pine trees that were so big they were 7 meters around. And one of the things I love about this painting is it shows, those pine trees in the background. And you can just imagine all of Toronto, being covered with these pines. And I also like how this painting shows Indigenous people here on the territory. If you look closely, of course, you'll see the British flag flying, an early sign of that colonial invasion and colonization of Turtle Island, the superimposing of British names on the territory. So this encampment of settlers is called York. There's a York in England, of course, but they superimposed the towns in England onto Michisagig territory. But if you look closely, you'll see Indigenous people canoeing, and that this is their homeland. And you'll see them talking also to a British soldier. And that Michisagig, Nishnabeg, Haudenosaunee, and Wendat people were here, and they're still here. Despite European colonization and superimposition of British towns on their land, they're still here. And of course, as we acknowledge the territory, we acknowledge those ancient white pines that were cut down on this territory. And it always breaks my heart that they wouldn't even leave a couple old growth white pines for us. Now, as we acknowledge the territory, we recognize the diverse lifeways of Indigenous nations on this land. And the Michisagig Nishnabeg are migratory people, so they would camp seasonally and have like a summer camp, a fall camp, a winter camp, and they would move seasonally along the waterways following the migration of animals and the salmon, of course. But this way of life was really attacked by the European settlers, this migratory lifestyle, and it was demonized. They even taught that it was unchristian to move seasonally into camp. And it's quite ironic if you think about it, because this is a painting, and literally the subtitle for the painting was, that this is 1803, 10 years after the founding of the York Encampment by John Simcoe. And so settlers, were living in an encampment in the land we now call Toronto. And I think it's so ironic because they demonize encampments, they demonize a migratory lifestyle, but settlers, themselves started in an encampment. So we recognize the ongoing leadership of Indigenous nations on this land, and we give our gratitude and our respect. And I turn it over to Sandra.
Okay. There was something mentioned in the chat. Yes, it was not a mass graves. It was individual graves. It was a large number of graves. But at the time when I recorded this, it's not current. This is when it first came out, and I did that recording. So I'd like to clarify that. So continuing on, talking about land, home, kinship, and family before colonialism. Like I mentioned, or haven't mentioned, but I'm notorious at talking about the different forms of spiritual expressions. There was the McDaywin Lodge, there was the Longhouse for the Haudenosaunee, and there was certain form and other like the Potawatomi and the Sacred Three Fires Society were all conducting that and part of their spirituality, and it was directly related to the land. And like Leigh mentioned with the land and the intent or the true meaning of it was you couldn't own land. It could be taken care of, it could be shared, very low carbon footing, and mostly it was about mutually taking care of it and just taking what you need, and not, for example, some places in the world when they cut trees down, they do forest clear cutting, or they're just going in there getting everything they need and not planning for the future and pulling out. So the way the society back then started from of course, from individual, like how you conduct yourself, how you took care of yourself, how you carried yourself, and trying to live on that good way of life, or the best way to describe it is the spiritual life, because everything was spiritual first, and then afterwards things materialized. And of course, that overflowed from the way you were raised and took care of yourself, and then how you conducted as a community, like in the home, that interrelationships that were being built upon, and then that kinship. And if you're talking to Anishinaabe or to Haudenosaunee individuals, there is that form of kinship, and that kinship was attached to animals. And that's almost like your last name, kind of, because that was the family you belonged to. So that's where that kinship came. But then there was a lot of nation to nation building. And in that nation and nation building, what happened was they, in my community, we call it the forever lasting shiny chain. And if you attend to it and take good care of it through mutual sharing, resource sharing, mutual information exchange, on the intent of taking care of and not going in for yourself, it just naturally flowed. And then what happened was that chain or that connection between different nations was good. And that's where you kind of get into the Wahpa belt. So the dish, well, the bowl and one spoon. And that actually was a peace treaty between the Anishinaabe and the Haudenosaunee. Because in the past, they were fighting over hunting territories, traditional territories, and farming territories. And paths were being crossed. And there was a lot of intermarriage between nation to nation. And it was very common and accepted practice, because it was supposed to be peaceful. But then anyways, it got to a point where they were fighting, and there was a war between them. But then way before Europeans came, they realized the hardship that it brought on to each nation. And then there was a peace treaty made, not to end war, but to, how would I say, create harmony within the ecosystem and the way of life, to continue that, and for the peace of, so things could continue to grow. And that's just briefly what I explained. I know it's a little bit of a history lesson we're giving you, but this is the importance of understanding what the Indigenous perspective, that it's not just the IRSS legacies, it goes way back. And that's where, when you're looking at an Indigenous perspective, You're not just looking at city bylaws, like municipal, you're also looking at the provincial and even federal arenas, which we didn't really tackle during COVID. We kind of kept it small in the GTA area. And I think I'm going to pass it on now back to, oh no, and so everything is connected in the district. I mentioned that nation. Yeah, through community building and through sharing. So now I'm going to pass it back on to Leigh, not unless she has anything to mention on the land, home, kinship, and family element.
Yeah, and Sandra.
Yeah.
It was very powerful, and I love the historical context that's given. When we were looking at putting our presentation together, we picked this image by Peter Bigody because it really shows the family, right? But it shows that the land is part of that family, and the animals are part of that family, and at the center there's a circle. And it's really just demonstrating this beautiful idea of family as really being, all of our home. And that home, includes all the beings that we depend on intricately for life. And that image, of course, is contrasted with this image of a residential school. So this is the Mohawk Institute, which is one of the closest residential schools run by the Anglican Church of Canada, and before that, the Church of England, before Canada was established as a nation. And so we turn, now to the impact of colonialism on this idea of home, on this idea of family. So as colonization, swept to this land, it was really part of a global strategy on the part of the British Empire and other colonial powers to develop wealth for their empires. So it was the period of discovery, so-called discovery, was really all about development of wealth and power and resource extraction. And it was a competition between different empires, the Spanish, the French, the British, etc. And so when the British, which is kind of the focus of our presentation, because this is, of course, in the Anglican Church, when the British came to Michi-Sagig and Haudenosaunee territory here, they were focused on resource extraction and building an economy based off of resource extraction. So those great white pines that I talked about, 7 meters around, can you even fathom what an old growth, white pine would look like? Those white pines that were covered this area all the way, towards Montreal, they were cut down by European settlers, and they were used for British war and trade ships. And what was held on those British trade ships? It was often enslaved people. So those great white pines were used to make the fuel and the power of the British Empire. And so those white pines were transformed into ships of war that were used, to colonize the lands and take people, steal people from nations around the world, indigenous people, and enslave them to make profit for the empire. So here on Turtle Island, indigenous people were also enslaved under the British Empire and the other colonial empires. But when indigenous people were enslaved here, they were actually often sent to the Caribbean. So if you were, Haudenosaunee or a Michi-Sagig person who was captured and enslaved, they wouldn't enslave you here because indigenous people knew the land so well that they would actually run away. And they were very successful in running away and evading people who enslaved other humans. And so they would instead capture indigenous people here and send them very far away from their home so that they weren't able to escape. And this concept of enslavement and labor and extracting the labor of human beings to develop extreme wealth for those in power is really a huge part of the foundation of the colonial project of Canada. And so through this, was also the missionizing efforts. And the early missionaries to this territory were also bound up in this resource extraction project and this idea of making profit off of the land and off of the people of the land. And so the early Christian missionaries, if you read their sermons, they were always attacking a migratory lifestyle. If you go back and you read sermons from Anglican priests in the early 1800s and the 1700s, they were saying, if only the Indigenous people would stop migrating, they would stop following the seasons, stop following the animals, and settle down, then if they would cultivate the soil, then they would, be good Christian citizens. So there was the Christianizing effort. It was also about stopping the migration of Indigenous people. And this was really, to get people to abandon their hunting grounds so that they could be further encroached by settlement and resource extraction. And so this concept of trying to make Indigenous people, to stop them from migrating, to stop their ceremonies, and take away the strength of their nations, was really also bound up with this project to extract the labor of Indigenous people and to make work camps for Indigenous people so that European settlers could profit off of Indigenous labor. So the earliest residential schools were established in the 1600s by the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel, which became the New England Company, which was an Anglican missionary society. And their idea was to take Indigenous people and turn them into something profitable for the Anglican missionaries. So across the land, they would open institutes, and we call them now day schools. And children were essentially enslaved while they were at the day school. They weren't paid and they didn't do any teaching and learning. They were instead expected to do labor, to generate wealth for the New England Company and the Anglican missionaries. And in these day schools, which were across the land and as early as the 1600s, Indigenous children were tasked with wagon making, carpentry, blacksmithing, weaving, sewing, housekeeping, and spinning. Anglican run institute in St. John, New Brunswick in the 1780s. There were 6 of these institutions, and they were under the guise of converting Indigenous people to Christianity through schooling. And so Anglicans fundraised to run these institutions in England and all here across the territories. And in 1822, there was an inquiry into these institutions, and the inquiry found that there was no education and no schooling being taught at all. Instead, children were put into forced labor, and they were forced into industry as maids and essentially enslaved. Anglican missionaries who ran the schools profited off of the labor, and the institutions were notorious for sexual violence and abuse. Slavery was formally banned in the British Empire in 1834, and that same year, the Mohawk Institute, who's pictured here, added dorms so that children would no longer attend it as a day school, but they would have to sleep overnight and stay there year-round. So there was a profound colonial effort to force Indigenous people into workers under capitalism. And this is really the foundation of the Indian residential school system. It really was not about education, but it was about extracting profit. And a really sad thing is, as the reserve system was created and Indigenous people were confined to small parcels of land, not allowed to migrate with the seasons, not allowed to hunt and fish beyond their, reserved lands. They were paid, treaty money, which is a very small amount of money every year. And as the Indian residential school system was developed, bands were forced to pay 25% of their income they received from the federal government back to the federal government to pay for residential schools. So it's a really sad kind of part of the history that's often not talked about. And the Indian Association of Alberta in 1946 spoke out, and they wrote a report to the committee, one of the committees that was responsible for the Indian Act. And in 1946, they said, no white parents would ever tolerate for an instant this form of education. This form of education in the Indian residential schools is nothing more than child labor. So in the late 1800s, after the Métis rebellions against the Canadian state, Indigenous people were required to hold a pass to leave their reserve. So in response to these rebellions, these resistance movements, the pass system was developed so Indigenous people weren't allowed to leave the small tract of land that they lived on, the reserve system. And so the Indian agent functioned often as the priest, as the judge, as the police officer, as the person of authority over the entire reserve, and monitored the actions, the comings and going of all the Indigenous people on the reserve. In this sense, reserves have been described by a Lakota elder that I met at Standing Rock as a prisoner of war camp. And in 1920, the Indian Act made residential school mandatory. So we can see this development of the Indian residential school system as really being about removing Indigenous people from the land, breaking up the power of the clan system within families that was used to govern land and treaties and govern territories. And that really this system was part of the architecture of genocide, which was connected to the breaking of treaties, the theft of Indigenous land, the forced relocations, and the imprisonment really of children in residential schools and day schools, and how that has continued to this day. So with our work with community members, so many of the community members that we work with, are survivors of Indian residential school. We're subjected to deep pain, and these systems continue in their life. And so this is something that Sandra Campbell often speaks about as the Indian residential school legacy. We see this legacy in the overrepresentation of Indigenous people in prisons, in child welfare, and the shelter system. And these systems are very much connected to this legacy of the residential schools. And it can be very re-traumatizing for Indigenous people to have to go through these systems of prisons and shelters because they really mirror the conditions of the residential schools. Survivors of these assimilation policies continue to be directly impacted by the ongoing legacy of these government policies. But survivors have continued to resist the abusive culture of denial and silence of the residential schools through the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and successful class action lawsuits of the Indian day schools and the 60s Scoop survivors. So we really see, the power of Indigenous people with resisting the culture of residential schools and breaking the silence about the impact of this legacy on the concept of home, the concept of family, and the freedom of people. Sandra, do you want to add anything to this section?
Yes, the kind of like earlier you mentioned the way of thinking and about those white pines and how large they were. And the importance for the Indigenous thought on the white pines. Based on the Hautestonis' teachings, they talk about the great law of peace. And that great law of peace was, the symbolism was that white pine tree. And part of that school of thought or way of living was that the pine tree had 4 roots. It's almost like envisioning the medicine wheel. And the belief system was if you followed that great peace, like following the Creator and putting Christ in your life and living that good way of life, eventually you'll end up being drawn up into that trunk and then brought out into the branches, and everything will like kind of become fruitful as it's sent up. But on top of that tree was the eagle, and that eagle takes everything up into that spiritual realm. So that was the reason, and it was a really sad time, especially for the Haudenosaunee when they saw those great pines being chopped down for war, when it's supposed to represent peace. War to build an empire, when something was already existing in that region. So that's one point I want to point out. And the second point is about the migration. And yes, Indigenous were migrating. And it even happens to today, making it relevant, that when asked, and I'm asked, oh, how many Indigenous people live in Toronto? How many Indigenous are Anglicans? And we can't really give a direct number. And that's because still to this day, individuals and families still have that tendency to migrate. And we call that the transitional population, where they'll come in during the winter time when up north there's no hunting or whatever. And also some will come for the opportunity of employment, for housing, or even for education, or for health, because the specialists are in this, in the city of Toronto. So it's very difficult to give that exact number on the Indigenous population in the GTA area. So I just like to leave it at that and just add that on. Thanks, Leigh.
Yeah, thank you. So beautiful, the teachings of the white pine. And here in this image, you'll see a Anishinaabe wigwam, a photo from the 1930s, and a beautiful Anishinaabe painting. Also, my screen is blocking it, but it's by one of the Beardy family. And these concepts of home and land and living with the land, is so important when we think about Indigenous worldviews. And it's in great contrast to this kind of concept of private property that governs our cities and our common spaces. So in the earliest treaties between the Crown and the Michisa-Gig Anishinaabe in Toronto, they were very clear, the Anishinaabe were very clear in saying that we're not giving up our right to hunt and fish on our lands. We're happy to share the land, but that we will always have the right to camp on our land and move seasonally. And so they were, very clear on that being enshrined in the early treaties, but the British officials didn't recognize that right. And so as soon as these treaties were signed, settler expanded throughout the GTA, and with this concept of private property. And so Michisa-Gig would come down from the Kawarthas in their canoes to fish the salmon in Lake Ontario, and they would camp where they'd always camped, and suddenly a settler farmer would be there chasing them with guns and dogs off the land, saying, "This is my property, get off my property," right? And so there's this great conflict of worldviews, that you could own land, and that land, is solely yours and belongs solely to you. So we see this now, that the concept of home and family was greatly assaulted by the Indian residential school system, and by the PASS system, by the reserve system, by all these policies. And so it really robbed a lot of Indigenous nations and people of home and of family. These things were taken away from generations. And so because of these factors, a lot of Indigenous people are houseless right now. And they live on the land in the city of Toronto, and they use bushcraft that many of them learned as children before they were taken to residential school. They learned bushcraft from their grandparents. Many lived, you know, in the bush with their families, and they built these kind of structures to survive and move seasonally following the trap line. And so they use these skills to help each other survive. But Indigenous people across the territories are ticketed, you know, for camping on the land, for living on the land, and practicing these life ways. And here, of course, in the photo, we see by our offices a camp that a person has set up. And Sandra and I wrote a book chapter about these themes, along with a gentleman, Blue Sky. And I'm just going to read a quote from a community member who is Anishinaabe and who lives on the land. And this quote comes from our book chapter in the book Displacement City. When we camp on the land, we share and are respectful. We take care of each other. We are a family. But security guards always come and kick us out. They say, "You've overstayed your welcome." I say back to them, "This is our land. This is native land." And they reply, "This is the Queen's land." And then they call the cops on us and escort us off the premises.
And continuing on, just quoting a little bit from the book chapter that we did. Initially, when we tried to address it, we only had a small, you know, the part. And we thought at Toronto Urban that to start to bring the conversation open. And we worked real hard on the chapter. We tried to condense it. We only had so much time, but it was an invitation for someone that's in the Indigenous community to open up and dwell deeply into the things that we talked about. But I would like to bring out a quote here from the Canadian Observatory on Homelessness. And it was an Indigenous who did a little bit of research about maybe, I don't know the exact time, but the concept of homelessness and houselessness is very much, I know at Toronto Urban, we've been defining it because we talked about the concept of land, the concept of property, of ownership. I know it's a historical concept, but it's still relevant to today. But this quote says, the Indigenous definition of homelessness considers the traumas imposed on the Indigenous peoples through colonialism. According to the definition of Indigenous homelessness in Canada, it is a human condition that describes First Nations, Métis, and Inuit individuals, families, or community lacking stable, permanent, appropriate housing, or the immediate prospect means of ability to acquire such housing. Indigenous homelessness is not defined as a lacking of a structure of habilitation. Rather, it is more fully described and understood through the compensate lens of Indigenous worldviews. So that quote there, as you unpack it, is saying that how can you, and a lot of Indigenous perspectives even today say, how can you call us homeless when we're already on our territory, when things have been taken away? We have no house. Yes, so now we are houseless, but we're not homeless. And I know we've had to push back on that, even while we were working in different collectives because of our perspective. And that gave us a unique position, like I mentioned, not just citywide, but also provincially and federally under the treaties. So when you're looking at an Indigenous houseless individual, it's a bigger picture of just not having, you know, a house. And it's a little bit more deeper because the historical context still affects today. And the members and individuals that are experiencing this, they're living it. It's not like they lost their job or they have mental health or they have addictions. It's a little bit more deeper and more complex because the interrelational relationships and the connections and how things have flowed with history to the relevancy to today. So I just thought I'd throw that in there too. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. And we really see, you know, as the quote from the community member, right? That when we camp on the land, we share and we are respectful. We take care of each other and we are a family. And that's really what happened when the pandemic swept across the land. The shelters were full of COVID. They were downsizing shelters. They were closing shelters when shelters were in outbreak. And as we already shared, the shelter system is very triggering for a lot of our community members because it replicates the conditions of residential school. You're crowded, you're a number, not a name. There's very bad food, bad quality food. You don't have control over when you go to bed, when you get up, you know, where you have to put your stuff, what you eat. You have no agency and no control over any of these things. So it really mirrors the residential schools and foster care and prison, and it can be very triggering for people. So a lot of people, you know, without the option of housing, even to get into a shelter can almost be impossible in the city. So a lot of them, you know, take up public space and camp on the land. And so when the pandemic happened, everything closed. You couldn't you couldn't use a bathroom. There was no access to running water in the downtown, and a lot of services that people depended on closed. So we supported people living on the land as they resisted themselves and they took up public space. And through their own networks of kinship and mutual aid, they helped each other survive in a period when it was almost impossible for them to survive. Sandra, do you want to speak to this?
Yes, too. I know a lot of individuals had shared with Leigh and myself about the violence experienced in the shelter systems and the temporary hotels. And a lot of the individuals were experiencing when they were there, because we just didn't encourage encampments, and we also tried to keep connected because we built that trust relationship with the individual, and they had the choice if they chose to go into a temporary hotel. But they experienced a lot of violence and a lot of silencing. If they tried to speak up, they were shut down. And it could have been easily through violence by all of a sudden they're labeled by the staff worker at the temporary hotel as, oh, they're high maintenance because they're speaking up and they should be grateful. So what happened was a lot of them were either discharged rather quickly. The other clients from that temporary hotel would gang up on the Indigenous. There was a lot of violence and discrimination during COVID in those temporary hotels. That even after, when things started opening up, I have networked with 55 Division and the Business Improvement Association in the downtown area. And what the police said when we were called in, which was quite frequently called if you were an Indigenous or Black, because they were speaking up because of the things that was going on in that system. They said it was worse than walking into an alleyway ghetto. It was horrific, and they were shocked that the city was able to have this, and there was really nothing for the client. So I just like to throw that in there too. So a lot chose to live off the land and said, it's not worth it. I'm staying there. And now that things are opening up, they still are choosing to gravitate towards the encampments to this day. Allen Gardens, the numbers are starting to pick up again. I saw 50 tents that looked like a wigwam.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you. And so, of course, as Indigenous people work for their mutual survival, we see a lot of pressures. The city bylaws are enforced, people are ticketed for camping on the land, and some people are even criminalized and arrested for camping on the land. And so we worked with many partners to be able to provide health services and different wraparound supports to people living on the land. And so here you'll see a mobile testing clinic by Anishinaabe Health that we worked with to bring to the people so they could access COVID care where they were, as they were on the land. And so here's some photos of our work together and with community members to provide, medicine bags, ceremonial items and hot meals and the things that people need, to survive and ultimately to thrive. And trigger warning, this photo, this painting, The Scream by Ken Monkman is quite painful. But, when we think about this reality, right, of Indigenous people not having homes, not having houses, not having running water, not having these basic access to dignity because of the impacts of colonization, how is the church responsible? What does the path of justice look like for the church? The church was such a big force in the attack on Indigenous families, the attack on Indigenous home and homelands. And what are our responsibilities as church? In the city of Toronto and across all of Ontario, we see that land is being commodified. Here, a person has built a condo sign into a temporary little shelter for themselves to keep the rain off their body. And you see, it says that the condos are starting in the 600,000s just for a tiny little studio apartment. So land has been commodified, housing has been commodified to maximize profit. And what is the church's responsibility here? The church is still one of the biggest landowners across the country. And how can the church work to give land back to Indigenous nations and Indigenous people? What does justice look like here in our territories? So these are some questions that we leave you with here today. Sandra, any closing thoughts you'd like to share?
No, I think for now we just gave a little taste for everyone. Time is closing. It's 2 p.m. and I look forward to contributing on the Q&A. Sorry, I have a thick tongue today.
That's wonderful. Well, thank you so much, everyone. And we close with this beautiful screen print. And it really, again, shows this interconnectedness between the person and all creation in the land. And it really stands in contrast to this idea of commodification of the land and power over the land and one another. And so now we open it up to Q&A. Perhaps we can use the raise hand function. And we're happy to receive your questions. Any questions at this time?
I have a question.
Okay, great.
What is the church doing about giving back the land? Has the Anglican Church taken any action on that front?
No, they haven't. And there's there's definitely, I think there's like a growing movement amongst lay people to want to see that kind of action. Even the church that we work a lot out of, Holy Trinity downtown, and other parishes, they were even built like before some of the treaties, and it really puts into question, you know, how that land was acquired. And through the doctrine of discovery, you know, the British Empire really just thought that it was their privilege and their right to take Indigenous land and do with it what they'd like. And that's still the foundation of, you know, property ownership across all Southern Ontario. And land is very expensive now, right? And so I really think that it is a responsibility of lay people in the church and clergy to be part of a groundswell to push for these kinds of things, because you know, the MAF Tithe Committee, which is funded by land property sales, is promising 10% of sales to Indigenous communities. But that's about $300,000 at the most right now. And that can't even buy one home in the GTA, right? Property sales are through the roof. So what would it look like if we used our land and our spaces to actually fully offer reparations? You know, that screen painting by Kent Monkman, it's haunting, but it really says, like, is 10% enough? You know, is what we are offering enough? The Anglican Healing Fund, for example, was supposed to be a permanent fund for Indigenous people to heal from residential schools, and it's being shut down at the national church level. So these kind of things are happening very quietly, and the church says, oh, we don't have money, or we can't fund this, etc. But, like, you know, what would it look like if we took the sins of colonialism seriously and repentance seriously? What would our decisions be like? Other thoughts people might have, other reflections?
Go ahead, Linda. You'll have to unmute. You need to unmute, Linda.
Hello, I want to ask a question. Does it seem feasible or a good direction to go to advocate for building housing, you know, perhaps an apartment building or in whatever shape, that would be owned and operated by Indigenous people for those who came to the city and needed housing? Does that seem like a reasonable direction to go in?
Sandra, you want to unmute yourself?
I don't have an answer to that. I'm so sorry.
Okay.
So let's see if we can attack it or
Mhm.
address it.
I did speak to a community member, a young mom, you know, and she's a big activist in the Indigenous community and a really big leader.
Mhm.
Her dad was incarcerated, and you know, so she grew up without that nice sense of home and family from the impacts of colonialism. And she said she would love the church to build Indigenous owned and operated cooperatives.
Mhm.
And she said across the city of Toronto, there's no Indigenous cooperative housing.
Mhm.
And so she was
Mhm.
saying to me, you know, that's an advocacy point we could work on in the church. Because I agree with your language, right? Like, you can't just offer small grants or do these little gestures, but if you really provide some money or some land and for the initiative to be Indigenous led and Indigenous directed, it changes things, right? It is a more powerful kind of offering to the community.
Yeah, the model of cooperative housing exists in Canada, and maybe that's a model that really fits the idea of a cooperative housing building.
Yeah, any other questions or reflections?
We had a nice comment from Joanna, who says, thank you both so much. Even though I've heard you several times, each time I learn something new, and I'm inspired by your sincerity and authenticity.
Thank you, Joanna.
I have a question. Sorry, I didn't raise my hand because I'm with my phone. And it's a bit different than the land bag that but I was thinking about the private security officers that are operating now in the parks, and when this so, and I'm not sure how this came. It was a bylaw, or how the private security officers came to life, to gently remove people from parks where they're camping. And this was done with the current mayor blessing. Is there some action, or maybe legal action, or I don't know, around what can be done about this? This.
Sandra, you want me to take a stab at it, or do you want to? Yeah.
I'll let you take a stab at it and then I'll add in after.
Okay. Yeah.
But I wouldn't use the word, yeah, I guess they gently removed, because I know other parts
Yeah,
of the world, they're
yes,
a little
I'm
bit more aggressive.
this is in quotation marks, right?
But it was
Instead
a
of
lot
police.
there was a lot of money spent
Yeah.
on clearing up the encampments. And I think the city was afraid because there was a lot of, my personal opinion is, they had a huge public relation team, the city of Toronto, and they'd come out every day or whenever and made announcements of this is what we're doing. And it was more or less pacifying the voter. We're all very concerned. Torontonians, we're living in the city, we work, we play, we go to school, we have families. And it was I think it was a forum of pacifying us to feel that city of Toronto is safe again. Yeah, so they had a big PR relations going on there, and they were writing their speeches. But I can say to you, when it came to the Indigenous houselessness, they did not respond to us at all. They haven't even responded to us today. Nothing. Of all the press media coverage we've done, rallies, petitions, protests, bringing out the big guns, we're dismissed. We're silenced. We don't matter. And this is the obstacle, or the conditions that Toronto Urban Native Ministry had to work around just to meet the needs of the ones that were on the streets. And you really saw the haves and have-nots. And it made you question how the city was spending the money that they had, because we were able to do a lot more than what this, with very little. And it was all through information exchange. We kind of became a hub. We got organized through, like we called it the Downtown Toronto East Collective. Then there was the Downtown West Collective. And then there was the shelter, was it Health, Justice Health Network. We were getting organized, and we were doing a lot of information exchange, resource sharing. A lot of parishes during COVID had their program shut down, and they were bringing in resources to us so that we could distribute it. Because for some reason, a lot were in the downtown Toronto region, and there was some on the outskirts, but more so they were gravitating, moving in, trying to meet their needs to be fed, trying to find a washroom, and things like that. And it just to say that we did have an impact, but the city still has not approached Toronto Urban Native Ministry. It's been silenced. So yeah, Leigh.
Yeah, and I'm just putting in the chat right now an invitation to join if you're in the Toronto area. And I know that this is a reality that everyone's experiencing in every town, from Aurelia to Newmarket. You know that this housing crisis is really it's a Southern Ontario reality, and it's really across the country reality, right? And the criminalization of people who are poor. And this is really a moral issue that, like, we do need to push back on as Christians. It's tax dollars that millions and billions are being put into criminalizing poor people, like who have already had everything taken from them, right? And so we do need to advocate, because despite all our advocacy, the exact same people got into power. In the area I live in, near Scarborough, the same councillor got in and he voted against all affordable housing motions in the past couple of years. And it's so frustrating, right? I'm like, how is this even possible? But these are the times that we live in, and we do need to organize. We do need to push back, because it's violence happening. And Sandra and I participate in the Homeless Memorial every month. It's also, if you're downtown, so come out to the rally I put in the chat, but also the second Tuesday of each month at Holy Trinity downtown, and it's at noon. And we also stream it live on Facebook. But that's the Homeless Memorial. And every month we add like a dozen names of people who've died, and we don't even know a lot of the people. Like, many people die without our knowledge. And every winter people freeze to death outside. And yet the city right now is looking to close the Novotel shelter on December 1st, and looking to close the Bond shelter and then renovate it. But these are hundreds of people that now will not really have a clear plan of where they're going to go. And every day when we call the shelter system to refer people indoor, even if it's a young woman, a teenager escaping violence, even if it's a residential school survivor who just got out of jail, like, no matter who people are, we can't get them a shelter bed. And it's a ridiculous thing for a city as rich as we are to have no availability anywhere. You know, it's very, it doesn't make any sense. And it's antithetical to life. And it's absolutely rooted in our church's history of colonization. So we're part of the problem. We got to take responsibility for that, and organize and labor, for change, because we're just seeing society go into greater commodification of land, greater inaccessibility, greater injustice. And it's because it's based on profit, right? We talked in our presentation today about that history, that legacy of extraction and profit being gained off of enslaved children through residential school. And that system still exists today, where if it's not profitable, it's not supported. And we really got to shift as Christians that mindset.
Thank you so much, both Leigh and Sandra. Oh, and Leigh is showing the Displacement City cover and the invitation to the book launch. So that's, did you want to speak to that?
Yeah, you'll be able to hear Sandra and I again, and that's November 9th. You're all invited. And also you can pick up a copy of this book where we really speak to these issues, and it's available now through Another Story Bookshop. So feel free to support it and come out to the event if you're able.
Okay, and it will be for sale on the day as well, I understand.
Yes.
From another.
Of course, and there'll be a book signing. We'll be signing the book. We'll be reading from the book. We'll be talking about it. And this book just gives you a taste of what was happening during COVID. It's an invitation. It's a door to open. And there's a lot more things to talk about and unpack. And that's the reason why we were a part of this. Is it was a start. And it's material that's through lived experience. Who would have thought, Toronto would shut down, COVID or any aspect. We were all lost. But there were some things that were happening in the city that was organically happening, that shift in mindset. And even the ones sitting at home, working from home or whatever, and, question, every aspect of their own life. And now that mindset is starting to shift, and it's kind of like, don't lose it, question everything, right?
Mhm.
Because, you know, we're paying our taxes and it seems like nothing's happening, nothing's being done. It's all based upon capitalism and getting rich. And we have to question ourselves as Christians and how we can make better change down the road. And it's not just for the houseless Indigenous, it's for everyone. It's for even for our young that want to be first home buyers and they can't even afford down deposit. You know, it goes on and it gets, you know, kind of complicated there, but yeah, please come out.
Mhm.
Thank you very much. We have a couple of other questions in the chat, but I don't know if we have time to take them up in detail right now, because we do have another session coming up. But thank you very much, everyone, for coming. And hopefully we'll see some of you in the closing reflection.
Mhm.
Thanks again.
Goodbye.
Bye.
Baba P until we meet again.
Thank you all
Thank
so
you.
much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.